Hello and welcome to this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective. Russia is in the crosshairs today for the deep dive. It has a fascinating policy in West Asia, one which seems to be an act of gymnastics. On the one hand, it seems to be okay with Israel. On the other hand, it seems not to be okay with the West. It backed up Assad, President Assad of Syria, for a long time. Then it seemed to, in some way, depending on which way you look at it, rescue him and accommodate him in Moscow, but essentially dump him and allow their erstwhile enemies, Ahmad al-Shara, who seems to be pretty much guaranteed an MI6 CIA frontman. And now we see Mr. Shara turning up in Moscow and fully welcomed by Vladimir Putin with all sorts of assurances for Russia's participation in Syria. What's going on? What is Russian policy in West Asia? Whose side are they on? Do they need to be on a side? And how does that impact BRICS and the whole supposed Eurasian axis opposition to the West? It really is quite a fascinating theatre of Operation West Asia at the best of times. But Russia's policy, of course, don't forget Iran and the looming war with Israel and America is also one where Russia will have to pick a side. It seems to have given weapons to Iran of late, military aircraft, even some rumors that Russian pilots may even be involved. So it has a huge interest still in West Asia, but its policies seem quite perplexing at times. With me to unravel the Russian involvement in West Asia is somebody who we have entertained on the show and welcome as a sort of on-the-ground independent journalist, Vanessa Beeley, no stranger to Western Asia, and somebody who has a fascinating take on Russia as well. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me back on to talk about this.
No, it's a pleasure. It's one of the few genuine voices that we can actually trust. So let's go straight into it. Give me your overview of what's been going on, and Russia in particular. The focus is on them because the last time we spoke, we talked about MI6, we talked about the CIA, and the very clear connections between ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, and indeed Mr. Shara himself, formerly Mr. Jolani. So having unpacked that, let's unpack Russia today. What do you think is going on?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to understand that Russia was never an ideological ally of Syria. That's a very important baseline to start from. Russia always had a pragmatic, realpolitik interest in Syria. Why? Because, of course, Syria gives it the only significant military base that it has in West Asia or in the Middle East. It's also a launch pad for Russia to the African continent, where, of course, Russia is building its influence alongside China to counteract that of NATO member states, including the US, the French, and Turkey. And so, therefore, from the beginning, really, when Russia intervened in 2015, they were very clear, and that's why, to a degree, they launched the Astana talks, to bring some pressure on President Assad to basically reform the constitution in Syria. And unlike Iran, that had a very clear red line about keeping President Assad in power in Syria during the regime change war, Russia always had, if you like, a more Russia-centric view, which for Russian interests, it wasn't actually particularly important whether President Assad remained or whether through some kind of brokered democratic process, someone else could be brought to power that would be more suitable for the control of Syria. So that was always the difference between Iran's perspective and Russia's perspective inside Syria. And also remembering that really Russia came into Syria in 2015, late 2015. Up until that point, and this is, it's not the whole reason, of course, that Russia came in. It came in to defend its own interests inside Syria and to maintain stability. Because the last thing Russia wants is basically a crescent of instability to the south of Russia's own borders, basically. And that's another reason that it's forming this strategic partnership with Iran. But also from 1999 until 2014, there had been multiple Chechen terrorist attacks, both in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, quite significant casualties and deaths from those attacks, terror attacks on Russian territory. And so therefore, for Russia and for China, actually, the benefit for them also was to use Syria as a kind of buffer zone, and to some extent allow the exportation, or even in Russia's case in 2014, there are reports saying that Russia was actually facilitating the transit of Chechen terrorists from Chechnya through Turkey and into Syria, where, of course, the Syrian Arab Army fought against them and against the Uzbekistanis and the Tajikistanis for 14 years, and against the Uyghurs, the terrorists from the Xinjiang province in China. So for both countries, and even for Iran, there was a huge interest in containing this Takfiri escalation or expansion in Syria within Syria's borders and not allowing it to expand further.
So what changed? Because that was their modus operandi for several years. They supplied aircraft, their military bases, their air force bases were used to essentially turn the tide in the war against the Hayat Tahrir Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, and all the other various forces that were being sponsored by the West to overthrow Assad. What changed in the Russian estimation? Because they'd virtually won the war. They could have finished it off as well, because they were, they'd penned back most of the ISIS forces, essentially backed by Turkey and NATO, into the north. And yet, when it came to finishing it, they didn't really push that. Iran, I don't know what their perspective was, but certainly Russia seemed to put the brakes on through talks, the Astana talks with the Turks. Were deals done to let them off the hook? Was the change palpable from that moment on, or later, do you think?
I think whether it's mismanagement or whether there are greater motivations from Russia behind it. But the biggest mistake, there were a number of mistakes, in my opinion, in the management by Russia of the Syria file. But the major one was the 2020 ceasefire deal, 2019-2020 ceasefire deal, which was part of the Astana talks, to basically allow all of the terrorist groups, because of course it's not only Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a rebranding of Al-Qaeda in Syria, which was Jabhat al-Nusra, Jolani and Shaibani and others within Jolani's administration were the founders of Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, which was a kind of a discontinuity of their involvement with ISIS. And then HTS was an attempt to kind of rebrand themselves as not being Al-Qaeda and being the political opposition to the Syrian government. So in 2020, Russia, Iran, and Turkey effectively created this Al-Qaeda haven, as described even by Brett McGurk, the biggest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11 in Idlib. And whether they fell for Turkey's assurances that this would enable Turkey to dismantle Al-Qaeda and end the threat to Syria, and of course to the Russian presence in Syria at that time. Instead, what happened is that multiple players, of course, were funneling weapons and special forces, intelligence assets into Idlib. Washington was drone killing the competitors of Jolani, particularly in another group, Haras al-Din, the Guardians of Faith, in order to basically reinforce HTS under the control of Jolani. From 2021, it became very clear through particularly American media that Jolani was being groomed. If you remember the PBS interview with him when they trimmed his beard and put him in a suit and glossed him up for Western delectation as a political asset, not a Takfiri asset, basically. And then in the last 12 months before December 2024, there were actual Ukrainian special forces in Idlib training the Jolani forces, supplying drone technology. Turkey also was supplying drone technology, drones that had been used from 2020 onwards to target Syrian Arab army positions, for example, in southern Idlib, without Russian interception or interference. And Jolani was supplying militia also to go and fight in Ukraine against Russia. So a lot of people at that point in Syria were scratching their heads and saying, well, we don't really understand why Russia isn't allowing us to advance and actually end what is happening inside Idlib before it becomes a very clear threat. And this never happened. As I said, whether this is because Russia actually trusted Turkey to actually follow through on its agreement to dismantle Al-Qaeda, but it became very clear by 2024, 2025, 2023, 2024, that this wasn't going to happen. And then, of course, the rest is, to a degree, history. Damascus fell within 10 days from the brokered ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. And I could go into a lot of detail from on the ground, but I think, what I will say is the idea that the Syrian Arab army just downed arms and surrendered, and that's why Russia withdrew from the conflict and escorted President Assad and much of his entourage to Russia, is not entirely true.
Right.
The Russians abandoned Aleppo very early on in the first few hours of the attack on Aleppo. Iranian forces that were heading as reinforcements to the east of Aleppo actually met with the Russian forces heading back to Haimamin. Multiple generals that were standing their ground and withdrawing and then pushing back against HTS to the south of Aleppo were suddenly withdrawn inexplicably from the battlefield and put in prison. And certain other commanders that were put in control that historically were very much linked with Russia. And at that point, the Syrian army withdrew. There was complete chaos and confusion. And Russia, according to multiple reports, and I myself was on the ground, was bombing an empty ground. It wasn't bombing an HTS convoy that was heading from Aleppo further south. And another point to make here is that the terrain from Aleppo to Hama to Homs is very open. If an entire HTS convoy is heading on the main road, the Khanasa road from Aleppo to Hama,
sure,
they would be in the open. So it would be extremely easy to finish them off at that point. And we have to remember that Jolani has twice said that there were agreements with Russia that enabled them to advance as quickly as they did. And he repeated that when he went to the Kremlin. He said that they accomplished everything they did with the help or the assistance of Russia.
Well, that paints a really fascinating picture of collusion. One of the things that comes to my mind is often we talk about oligarchies, we talk about Israel and its connection with the US, and we talk about Zionist lobbies, and we talk about that sort of Jewish supremacist hold on America. But I want to shine a little light on Russia and some of the motivations around Syria, perhaps, and beyond, and Russian relationship with Israel, which I think has a big bearing on this, but is very rarely discussed. The Russians themselves have a lot of Chabad oligarchs and have a very large Russian population in Israel, which often goes unnoticed, which does influence Vladimir Putin's considerations when it comes to Israel. He gave pretty much carte blanche to Israeli F-35s or F-16s or whatever they were to regularly bomb Assad and Syria's military bases, and he did very little against it. The S-400s, which were reputed to have been given to Syria by the Russians, or were stationed there under their auspices, were never used. They were never even close to being used. So again, there seems to have been a very, very half-hearted support of Syrian sovereignty by the Russians. Is that because they were compromised internally by Israeli, if you like, influence at the highest level, perhaps in Russia? What's that relationship between Israel and Russia?
I think, yes, we have to understand the relationship between Russia and Israel, which is a very long-standing strategic friendship, and this is a very important point to make. When Russia came into Syria in 2015, there were negotiations with Netanyahu. And Netanyahu explained his red lines to Putin, who offered his reassurances that there would be no threat to Israel from resistance actors on the ground, particularly from Iran or Hezbollah. And that was a priority for Russia to basically protect, particularly the southern border with the Israeli-occupied Golan territories. Russia perceived itself as providing really a sort of UNIFIL operation in the south to hold back Iranian or Hezbollah resistance from reaching the border. That was number one. Also in 2015, Netanyahu spoke to Putin about the risk of nuclear development in Iran. And Putin actually said, okay, I'll act as mediator, but I'll ensure that Iran doesn't develop nuclear weapons that will in the future threaten the existence of Israel. But this also has a benefit for Russia, because how Russia perceived it is the Middle East was already unstable, thanks to the machinations of the imperialist bloc in the West and the Zionist bloc, which is Israel and the Gulf Arab states. So the last thing it wanted is Iran on its southern border also entering into a war with the US and Israel on the basis of it really having nuclear weapons. I would argue if it did have nuclear weapons, the potential is that Israel and the US would think twice about attacking it, just as they do with the DPRK. And in return, Israel basically took a very neutral stance over the Russian operations in Ukraine. It didn't participate in the imposition of sanctions on Russia, although it did agree to some restrictions. And it abstained from the UN vote on Russia's, in inverted commas, annexation of the Crimea. So what this demonstrates to me, and I think during Russia's operations in Syria, there was something like 49 phone calls between Putin and Netanyahu. When you talk about Israel systematically targeting not only Syrian Arab army positions in Syria, but also Iranian forces positions, and in the end, of course, they targeted the Iranian embassy in Damascus. And an Iranian general, after the fall of Damascus, gave an interview to the New York Times in which he said, look, Russia always turned off its radar when Israel was attacking. So, in a sense, Russia's partnership with Iran is definitely strategic. But at the same time, it's not going to jeopardize. So, in other words, it will prioritize its relationship with the Gulf states that are effectively apologists for the Zionist entity and its relationship with Israel itself. For example, since the October 7th genocide escalated for the last 2 years, both Russia and China have not taken any economic measures against Israel, which is in violation of the Geneva Conventions, of the UN rulings, of the ICJ, ICC, the recommendations of Francesca Albanese. China has effectively increased its trade with Israel, a genocidal entity. And Russia is still, for example, supplying coal. It's still facilitating the supply of oil through the Kazakhstan hub, and so on. So I think, again, as you said, this relationship between Russia and Israel is very much what governed Russian policy in Syria. The red line for Russia was always the existence of Israel and the security of Israel. Its priority in Syria was to secure its own interests. And that's why now you see Russia basically negotiating with Jolani, bringing him to the Kremlin. And that's not the first visit, because Assad al-Shaibani had already been to Moscow. Within Putin's administration, they were already talking about a new era of relations with Syria. Russia was among the first countries to normalize or legitimize the Jolani regime, while, of course, they were conducting massacres against ethnic minorities in Syria.
Again, a really fascinating angle, because it's often buried. The left here tends not to raise this issue of Russian complicity with Israel. It's very uncomfortable for a lot of the people on the left who want to castigate Western imperialism, but at the same time want to paint Russia as some kind of knight in shining armor. The reality seems that Russia operates primarily in its own interest. And I would, from your assessment, and maybe even from my own research, I get the impression that Russia essentially is Zionist, because it has no intention of backing a real Palestinian solution, it seems, either, and for that matter, nor does China. They are still going for the two-state solution, which essentially recognizes apartheid Zionist Israel. They don't oppose anything to do with Israel's kind of internal structure, the Zio-fascist nature, apartheid nature of Israel, as perhaps, say, if we were to compare it with South Africa and the movement against South Africa, it was unanimous that actually it couldn't exist, just as they wouldn't tolerate Nazism or Nazis or anything remnants of the Hitler establishment to have stayed after the Second World War. It just seems logical. But it's quite clear that, to me, that these states, whilst saying that they are a bulwark for multipolarity, for creating an alternative option for global South, particularly, in reality, a lot of what they do is just as nationalistically based as perhaps the Americans. Again, bringing it back again to the issue of whether Russia actually has any intention of supporting the oppressed, because this is a big narrative within the Iranian establishment. They too, you could argue, do it for their own national interests. They'd rather fight wars in West Asia than have the people from the Zionist fraternity coming and fighting the war in Iran, as they experienced for 8 years during the war that Saddam Hussein was financed to provoke. So there are all these very fascinating considerations. But would you say that Russia's commitment to this axis this alternative Eurasian axis, therefore, is a little muted as well? Because again, there are deals being done. China itself, with its own economic, supposed war with America, yet owning the debt of America. Russia itself saying it wants to de-dollarize, yet here we are doing deals in Syria. It's all rather cynical, isn't it, Vanessa?
Yes, it is. And I think, you're absolutely right. A lot of people on the left want to believe in this kind of vision of a savior coming from Russia or from China that is going to alter the paradigm that we're living in the world today. And I don't think that is true. I think Russia and China offer an alternative to resistant states and non-state actors to some degree. They offer an alternative, for example, to Iran to bypass US sanctions. But at the same time, I would guarantee that Russia and China in return are paying less for the resources that they buy from Iran.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
This is capitalism, actually. And this is the point. They are players within a global capitalist system. And I think that's the point that people need to, and people here in this region do understand it, by the way. They see, Syed Hassan Nasrallah, who of course was assassinated by Israel, the leader of Hezbollah, has said on numerous occasions very clearly, he appreciates what Russia did in Syria, but that they don't with the greatest respect, they don't consider Russia to be an ally. They consider Russia to be a potential partner where interests overlap, but they understand Russia's role. Iran, I think, is in the same position. And I would also reiterate that the Iranian revolution, the IRGC, Ayatollah Khamenei, are very committed to the support of the oppressed peoples in this region. However, Iran is a country. It had a democratic election. The people elected a reformist government, and a reformist government is going to be in slight contradiction to that philosophy and that ideology. And because Iran is an inclusive country, it's a huge country with a vast amount of sects and faiths living within the borders of Iran, it has to take that into consideration. But I think of all the countries, particularly in BRICS, Iran has done the most, of course, to counter what is happening both in Palestine, but regionally, in supporting non-state resistance actors, in supporting state actors like Yemen. And I'm not saying that Yemen or any of these non-state actors are proxies of Iran. They are allies of Iran in the war against neocolonialism and imperialism. And ultimately, I think with Russia, it's trying to keep all the balls in the air. That's the problem. From a Russian national interest perspective, its largest trade partners are in the Zionist bloc. So it would be extremely worried, for example, to come into direct conflict with Saudi Arabia or the UAE or even Qatar and Turkey to a degree, because it is dependent upon them for its economic future. And I think what is extremely interesting, if you look at what Lavrov said very early on in the genocide since October the 7th, which of course has been ongoing for the last 100 years. It didn't begin on October the 7th, as you know. And he said very clearly that what Israel is doing to bring about the demise of Hamas is what they should be doing in Ukraine against the Nazis. So he was effectively equating Hamas with the Russian operations against the Nazis in Ukraine, which is, for me, very, very telling. If you look at the statements from Kirill Dmitriev, who's just been doing a Steve Witkoff in the United States, I say that they're actually sort of copying the Trump policy of sending businessmen to negotiate as special envoys and so on. So Dmitriev has just done his tour of or has been to the United States.
I see.
And oddly enough, he's pushing the Islamophobic line. If you watched his interview with Lara Logan, he's talking about Europe and he's saying, the threat from the Muslims and so on. This is feeding into this narrative. The Islamophobic narrative that is now being amplified by Zionist assets in the UK and in Europe, and of course also eventually will come into the US.
Well, we talk about the genocide and we talk about the destruction of Gaza. I can't help but remember Grozny, and the Russians technically were one of the first in this century to do a blanket bombing and wiping out of a city, because the destruction of the Chechenian revolt, if you like, was actually a nasty business. They covered it up, and there was a complete radio silence and media silence on it, but it was pretty brutal. And it's almost like these kinds of powers would quite like the way Israel has operated. It's kind of broken all the norms. It's destroyed all the kind of, if you like, the rules of war in a way. And is something which now any of these totalitarian style powers could also utilize, AI, using all the kind of modern technology. And in fact, Russia, I would argue, nor China are really pushing back against what we know to be the Great Reset and what the World Economic Forum and what the UN and what a lot of the billionaires around the world want to implement, i.e. this kind of surveillance capitalism of sorts, surveillance totalitarianism. China's already doing it, to be honest. They're rolling out exactly what Klaus Schwab and company want to do in the West, and the Russians aren't far behind in terms of having a penchant for surveillance totalitarianism. So I question as to whether that as well, as to whether Russia itself is a bulwark against global money mafias, which is another problematic situation, that they're not really committed, it seems, to challenging those kinds of 21st century new forms of slavery, potentially.
Yes. And you have to remember, of course, that both Russia and China are working very closely with the UAE. That is an extension of the Israeli spy unit's development of AI and surveillance for genocide, basically. And UAE is using that technology effectively, as I said, as an extension of the Israeli technology, and using it to crack down on dissidents in the UAE and to spy on them, to arrest them, to then obviously torture them. And China is heavily involved in the development of this kind of tech with the UAE. At the same time, of course, the UAE is instrumental in the genocide that's now happening in the Sudan.
Yes.
Because it's supplying weapons to the RSF. But where are those weapons coming from? They're coming from China. And at the same time, China is then directly supplying weapons to the SAF. So both Russia and China are maintaining the destabilization in the Sudan to almost as much of a degree, if not more, than Israel and the West, in order to plunder the resources, the rare earth minerals, and the gold, and so on. And, you know, this sort of brings me back to this idea that these two countries, as the flagship of BRICS, are somehow going to bring about global change, move away from any kind of one world government, move away from this system of neocolonialism and plundering, support the little people, the oppressed peoples. But I actually don't really see any evidence of that. You know, when people talk about China helping Yemen, well, which Yemen did they help? They helped the Saudi proxy, illegitimate regime in the south, the UAE proxies in the south, the Muslim Brotherhood elements in the south. They didn't particularly come to the help of the Ansarullah resistant government in the north that has been effectively running the most effective campaign to end the genocide in Israel by targeting or by blockading the Red Sea. And it looted Yemeni oil through Saudi influence in the south for years. It supplied drones to Saudi Arabia to target the Yemenis, right? So, you know, I think we need to understand, while China's expansion is not necessarily as destructive as the US from a military perspective, let's look at the damage to the environment through its 80% monopoly of rare earth minerals.
Sure.
It is destroying the environment in some of the poorest countries of the world and is not being mitigated as far as I can find out. So in other words, sulfuric acids, uranium, all sorts of radioactive materials are being distributed into the waterways as a result of the processing to extract the rare earth minerals from the earth crust, right, for example. So where is the protection of the poorest people of this planet that shouldn't really be the poorest people? They should be helped to develop. They have the resources for their country to become incredibly developed, just as Syria was heading towards before 2011. So again, I just have to question the logic of people that can't see. And I'm not saying to distract away from what the West is doing. You know, I and everyone remains extremely critical or condemnatory of what the West has done globally for centuries. But we have to also hold China and Russia to account when they're effectively doing something similar, or they're not upholding international law by doing all they can to quarantine a genocidal entity like Israel that is slaughtering Palestinians on a daily basis, or even Jolani, who is massacring Syrians, including Christians, that Russia was supposedly in Syria to protect the Orthodox Christian communities, who are now being preyed upon by Jolani, just as the Alawites and the Shia and the Druze have been.
Well, it's a really honest appraisal, Vanessa, and I thank you again. But a concluding remark really about hope, offering some hope to those poor oppressed people, because they're scattered all over West Asia, less limited to that. Whether I go to Saudi Arabia, you've got a population which is suppressed there, thousands of political prisoners rammed up, which nobody talks about. Qatar is the same, UAE is the same. You've mentioned some of the UAE exploits, but they're operating across all the ports up and down East Africa and beyond, where this kind of this footprint of Anglo-Zionist imperialism is essentially through Arab Zionists is very, very much affecting the poor people around those regions. And so what's left is this kind of battered and bruised axis of resistance, or the ordinary people, the rank and file people who live in that region. Is it down ultimately to this force to stand up and really try to get real liberty? Because the Palestinians aren't going to get real liberty through the Chinese or the Russians, it seems, nor the UN can guarantee this, let alone, of course, the Anglo-Zionist Empire. Who's there to really give liberation, real liberation, to the Arab world in particular, or let's say the whole of West Asia?
The people and the resistance, and that's it. And I think this is the thing, that the armed resistance in the region have understood for years that they are on their own. And that's from Iran through Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. And so therefore they're preparing for the next stage in the war, and that includes, of course, the potential for a war against Venezuela, which considers itself very much part of the resistance axis, and Colombia, Cuba, Nicaragua, even Brazil. I mean, Trump is trying to mitigate Lula's support for Venezuela now by meeting with him and so on. And so therefore, but there are also, and that's a very important point that you made, there are resistance factions even in the Hijaz in Saudi Arabia, because remember, Saudi Arabia was a British creation in order to become an apologist for the Zionist entity and to protect it throughout its existence. And in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Qatar, as you mentioned. And so I think ultimately, Tom Barrett today has issued yet another threat. The special envoy to the Middle East for Trump has issued another threat saying, well, that's it. I give up. Lebanon isn't going to come into line. They're not going to disarm Hezbollah. So now, you're just going to get bombed, basically, is what he's saying. I'm paraphrasing. But everyone knew this was coming anyway, So I think the end war is coming, and those that will defend their freedom, their independence. And it's not only a Shia Islam crescent as it's described in the West. There are Christians, there are moderate Sunnis that don't adhere to the Takfiri Wahhabi ideology across the region that will join the resistance against this. And it's a war, as people here say to me very often, it's a war. They're not afraid of the war. What they're afraid of is if they lose the war and they have to live with what comes after. And I think that is something that applies to all of humanity, because if the war is lost here, the world is under the control of a very dark power, which emanates from the Zionist movement.
Well, I'm not going to add anything. Usually I give a little top and tail, but you've done a thorough job there, and really it's food for thought. And I think the resistance, this idea of resistance, perhaps if I am going to add something, it would be that the resistance is not Muslim. The resistance is not necessarily Christian. It's not even a thing between classes necessarily. This is about those who are oppressed and those who are oppressors. And you have to pick a side. Ultimately, from your moral, ethical perspective, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in China, whether you're in any part of the world, you really have to look at your own heart and your own morality and say, like, what is the moral thing to do here? If morality means anything to us anymore, it seems that the leaders and the establishments don't want us to have any kind of morality. But remember this, that whatever happens to the oppressed in one part of the world is inevitably going to come and it's going to affect you one way or another. We know that in Britain. Today we're being picked up for simply saying something against an Israeli entity, or even basically trying to oppose a Zionist ideology. In fact, that kind of censorship, that kind of draconian law, which you would never have thought less than 15, 20 years ago was possible in Britain, is now a reality. So if it can affect us here, I don't see why whatever's going on in the rest of the world won't be utilized by the same megalomaniac, nasty, rapacious, money-hungry, profit-hungry forces to implement and subject and enslave us here. So resistance at every level, whether you stop giving your consent to all of these kind of surveillance capitalism bills and laws, whether you actually stop buying goods from companies which are actually basically funding genocide or financing it one way or another, whether you withdraw your consent from state approval of their media, etc., you can resist in many, many ways. It doesn't have to be done just by the gun. It can be done through your own moral stance, wherever you are in the world. But that resistance is vital, because if we don't do it, then I'm pretty much guaranteeing you will be serving in a 21st century of surveillance, totalitarianism, whether it comes from China or Russia or America. It's coming, if not already here. Thank you, Vanessa Beeley, and thank you to the audience for watching this edition of The Deep Dive Perspective.